Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt?
and Max, talk about works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. Today's topic is the American Civil War, and we're going to start off with Guns of the South by Harry Turtledove. So, Matt, what is Guns of the South?
Well, Guns of the South is probably one of the most notable alternate history works out there. It's about 20 or so years old by Harry Turtledove. Basically what happens in Guns of the South is this isn't traditional alternate history, but time-traveling South Africans from 2014, white South Africans.
Racist South Africans.
Yes.
Hey, let's not generalize all South Africans as being like Rudy.
No, we're not doing this. Yeah, it's a guy named Andreas Rudy and his group. AWB, which turns out to be America Will Break. They bring AK-47s back to January of 1864. So this is after the Battle of Gettysburg, but before Grant's overland campaign of May to August of 1864. And basically, they demonstrate these weapons to the Confederacy, and particularly to Robert E. Lee, and they convince him to use them, and thus history gets changed. And I know this is a little bit sci-fi. This isn't exactly what most alternate history is, but it's a really good example because the diversion sort of from history is very clear in this work.
Yes. That's why it works very good for people who are not familiar with history. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit of a kind of a lesson for them because it's constantly comparing what should have happened to what is happening in this crazy, messed up alternate world.
Yes. I think it's really interesting because it has the change to the Civil War that most of us would imagine from alternate history, which is because they get AK-47s, basically the entire army of Northern Virginia gets them, and they win the war. We'll just skip to the end. Well, not to the end, to about the middle of the book. They win. They defeat Grant because obviously, 60,000 Confederates with AK-47s are going to outman 110,000 Union troops with musket-loading rifles, and these are fully automatic AK-47s, and they dominate. And they actually capture Washington, D.C., and they force the Union into a truce, into a surrender.
Yes. Specifically, they cede over West Virginia.
West Virginia stays with the United States in this.
Along with Maryland.
Maryland, yeah.
And they put the subject of Kentucky as well as, Missouri as well, up to a referendum.
States,
yeah.
Well, Delaware doesn't really count in this one, but
right.
But they were a border state, but it's really Kentucky, Missouri become the real big question marks here. Mm. And they actually what they do is the book goes beyond that. It's only about halfway through the book that the war ends, and then it goes into this discussion of the post-war Confederacy where Robert E. Lee becomes president. And it's really interesting because these guys, these South Africans, have helped the Confederacy win the war, but things start to go a little bit south from there for them. And their relationships with people like Robert E. Lee. And I think what happens is that actually they try to influence the referendum in Kentucky, and they pour a whole bunch of gold Krugerrands, into a campaign to elect Nathan Bedford Forrest, who in reality was the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan.
I believe that is correct.
Pretty not a very nice guy, former slave trader, one of the more despised figures from the Civil War, and rightfully so. And they actually start running guns into Kentucky too, and they try to kill Abraham Lincoln. I can't remember. He's there. He shows up in Kentucky because he was born in Hardin County.
Well, they definitely try to kill Robert E. Lee eventually.
They do. That's the surprise. Spoiler, folks. Later on, Robert E. Lee starts to float this idea of gradual abolition of slavery, I believe, because he doesn't see it as useful anymore. And they try to kill him with Uzis, so they bring in some more weapons too. Yeah. And they end up killing a lot of other people, not Robert E. Lee, and eventually Lee defeats them and destroys their time machine, which is located in North Carolina, somewhere in North Carolina is where they have it.
Rivington?
Yeah, Rivington, that's right.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a real place in South Carolina.
Not really sure either.
Never really checked. But
it's a pretty cool part of the book where they besiege the entire town.
And it's hard to defeat these guys because they have like built-in defenses and they have automatic weapons. And yes, the Confederates have AK-47s too, but they don't bring back like tanks or anything. There's no airplanes. Right. So the Confederates still have Napoleon, bronze cannons or bronze cannons that they're using. So eventually they defeat them. They destroy the time machine, but then they discover once they go through the library that these guys have built up is that they were lying the whole time. And Max wants to talk about this.
Well, yeah. in one of the subplots, like one of the minor characters' girlfriends comes across this illustrated history of the Civil War, and she ends up giving it to Robert E. Lee, and Lee realizes that the South Africans were lying quite a bit. Like, for instance, they said that in Lincoln's second term, he becomes a tyrant and does all these terrible things. And after him comes President Thaddeus Stevens.
Who was the radical Republican Speaker of the House during the Civil War and a subject of much hatred in the South.
Yeah.
Almost as much as Lincoln, because he was viewed as a very sort of, and he was a very dangerous figure, at least to the South. And he was a big driver in Reconstruction policy. And Reconstruction is a little bit outside the scope of this podcast, but he's a very interesting figure. But he was very reviled in the South, and obviously you can see this reaction that they would have to something like this.
Lee says, well, they might as well just elect John Brown at that point, because that's just getting ridiculous. And at this point, Robert E. Lee has completely turned to 180. Like, he's got all these grand designs about getting rid of slavery.
And he does, actually, by the end of the book.
It's actually interesting because Turtledove keeps in mind the Confederate Constitution, because there's all sorts of roadblocks to Robert E. Lee to reforming the Confederacy. Like, for instance, the Constitution guarantees the right for a man to own slaves, which is just how do you get around that
without changing the very basis of it? But I do want to mention sort of an interesting part that I like towards the end is at the very end that Robert E. Lee is getting a report about how Union troops have invaded Canada. They're fighting a war with Britain. But guess what, guys? They have AK-47s too, and not AK-47s that they stole from Confederate troops. Copies of them. They've captured AK-47s and they've copied them successfully.
It's like the Chinese.
Robert E. Lee is very worried because he thinks that after Canada, the Union is going to turn to the South. Yeah. So I think that's a very interesting end, and I think we were going to talk about what we liked and didn't like about it. And you mind if I go first? I think that's one of the things I like about it is that it tells us that people in the past weren't stupid, and it builds off the fact that the Union had incredible, for its time, production capacity, and absolutely, if they captured even one or two copies of AK-47s from Confederates, they would have found a way to not only re-rig it back mechanically, but they probably would have figured out how to make smokeless gunpowder too, because a black powder machine gun just isn't going to work. Not an AK-47. But I like that, in that they say that the Union has, that they figure out how to do this, and that so basically it's not giving the Confederacy all the advantage. Basically telling you that in a way the Confederacy is sort of on the clock, perhaps. Yeah. That the Union isn't going to be stuck with with Springfield rifles, and the Confederates are always going to have AK-47s, and that they in turn may be able to develop the technology better than the Confederates, because I do not believe that Turtledove ever has the Confederates make a actual working copy of it, that they're still stuck with the guns that the South Africans have given them.
Though the Confederates also have other advantages because they have that compound that they raided that the South Africans escaped through their time.
Don't they capture light bulbs or something like that? I don't know if they know how to work them or something like that. But they capture other futuristic materials. I don't think they have computers or anything.
I think there's some broken computers
but
that
they don't
work.
Use them,
yeah, they also have broken radio components, and if they can figure out how to use a radio, that's huge.
That's a world changer.
Yeah, that changes everything.
But I don't think they ever really indicate that.
Right. They've got nitroglycerin because at the end of the book, Robert E. Lee starts taking it.
He's
for
very
his heart.
heavy. Well, he's very heavy. He's very healthy. Sorry.
Yeah.
But they give him actually earlier in the book, I believe Andreas Rudy, who's like the main villain, the South African. He shows up to Lee and he gives him this little pill bottle, and it's in glass, and it's nitroglycerin, and he says, I know from the future that you have heart problems, and you haven't really made this clear. Like, you have health issues. Like, take these pills and you'll feel better. And he actually he takes the pills and he does feel better during the shortened version of the Overland campaign that actually happens in this book. And so it's like 18. I think the book ends in about 1870, which was the year that Robert E. Lee actually died in real life. And he says he feels like he's in very good health and, ready to lead the Confederacy onward.
No wife though, so I guess he's back in the dating game.
That's right. No, his wife does get killed in the book. Yeah. She gets killed by an Uzi blast. And I think
one of the
Jeb
best
Stewart
parts.
gets killed too. I think Jeb Stewart definitely gets killed. There's some other Judah Benjamin maybe.
Yeah,
a whole bunch
he
of
definitely
people.
does get killed.
Yeah. It's mayhem, and they show up with Uzis, and they'd never seen this because all they know is that these guys are bringing them AK-47s, and so the Confederate soldiers have AK-47s, but they do not have Uzis. So
That's one of the best parts of the whole book is that one of the Confederates picks up the gun and it's like made in Israel. What?
yeah, well that goes
Like
back
the
to the
Israelites?
thing,
I don't.
yeah.
In the Bible?
But I'm trying to think. That's what I like. I think there was some dislikes that we had about this, and
Yeah. I have not read Robert E. Lee's autobiography, but I can't help but feel like Turtledove is putting the modern viewer in the shoes of Robert E. Lee. Like he's maybe making him a little bit too much of kind of like a Nelson Mandela sort of
yeah,
figure.
you say the white Nelson Mandela.
Yeah,
That's what
he's
you
a
said to
white
me when we were
Nelson-
discussing
yeah.
this before we started the podcast. He Robert E. Lee was a great general, tactician. He wasn't Nathan Bedford Forrest. He wasn't a hardcore advocate of slavery, but he would have been, for his day, would have been considered a moderate. For our day, would be considered a racist.
Yeah.
But the truth is that Robert E. Lee is somewhere between the modern day but he's no Mother Teresa here.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to say is that Robert E. Lee he was not this incredibly progressive mind. And also Robert E. Lee stuck out of politics mostly because his job during the war, honestly, he didn't have much time to worry about politics because he was just trying to find ways to hold back the Army of the Potomac and to keep the war together, even give the Confederacy a fighting shot, not just winning it. So it's that's a weakness. I think we talked about the fact that the Confederates sometimes seem a little bit like just accept anything, and maybe I think Turtledove writes it off as the fact that they're so desperate, but they're bringing in Krugerrands, and I think we were talking about this before that their money has dates on it.
Right, exactly. Like one of the sub characters goes to turn in his Confederate dollars in return for hard mineral currency, and he gets gold, and he's shocked by it. He gets Krugerrands, but I'm wondering don't those have dates on them? And what do you do about that? Do you chisel the dates off? Well, that's going to look really suspicious to everyone around the world.
Yeah.
They're trying to keep the whole South African thing, South African future thing secret. They're just saying, oh, the guns are coming from Rivington, and then making no
Robert
explanation.
E. Lee knows the truth because he actually does confront them, because Robert E. Lee he graduated second in his class at West Point. He was a smart guy, and he does actually confront them and say there is no way anyone in the world has this sort of technology. And then he and about 5 other people I think know the truth that that they really are from the future. But then it later comes out. But I think also. And the Confederates just accept the AK-47 so openly, and it may be because they were, the desperation of the fact that January 1864 is, probably clear in reality. This was at least to a lot of Confederates that winning a clear-out victory in the war may have been impossible at that point.
Right. I mean, maybe they didn't know that yet, but as historians, 100%, it's done.
Yeah, it pretty much is. After Gettysburg and Vicksburg, July 3rd and 4th, 1863, basically. After that, you can sort of write off the Confederacy. Or people can argue. People do have argued about this, but that's how we see it. And also the terminology sometimes. I know Max got really worked up about the fact that they use the word clips instead of magazines.
That's a pet peeve of mine. I don't like that. I mean, I know Turtledove is not... he's
not a military guy.
He's
not a military guy. He writes a lot of excellent alternate history, and I will say this is sort of my plug for him because I've read a lot of his works, and he's got a ton of. He may have more alternate history work out there than any other author, and it's really good and it's very varied. There's a whole huge series of about 10 books that are about an alternate Confederacy. It has nothing to do with no time travel, no AK-47s. Just they managed to win the Civil War through conventional means, but then it takes it all the way out to past a World War II, basically conflict, and it's really good. So if you want to start out with alternate history, Harry Turtledove is really good, or there's alternate history anthologies out there too that can be really good.
Yeah.
So I think we want to move on from here. I think we're ready to go to our next step, which is the next part of the podcast, which is the topics section, which we would consider the topics section is where Max and I have discussed before we did the podcast some alternate history scenarios. And we're going to talk about what they are, how likely do we think they could have been, sort of what would be the result of them, and so we're sort of taking our own take. So we're moving beyond sort of reviewing alternate history literature. And Max, do you want to start off? Or?
Yes. So a large part of the Confederacy becoming its own nation, a Confederate victory, if you will, is international recognition. So obviously the North is not going to recognize them.
Yeah.
Like they're going to do their very best to not recognize them.
And prevent people from recognizing them.
Exactly. So they really need to. Basically, it's just France or Britain is who they need.
I think there actually were a couple countries that recognize the Confederacy. The only one that comes to mind is, I believe, the Sultan of Morocco recognized the Confederacy. I read that in a book, some sort of like factoid book about the Civil War a couple years ago. But basically, what we're trying to say is that you needed Britain and France. Those were the two powers who could have helped, and the British, the Confederates very much lobbied to do so.
Yes, Judah P. Benjamin very much tried to get the British into it. Another big part of that is the fact that both of those countries have navies.
Yes, especially the British Navy is the best navy in the world at this point.
If they could have convinced them, that would have been huge. But here's the problem, though: slavery. The British Empire was very much against slavery at this time. Like they had
slavery had been abolished in the early 1830s, 1834, yes. I believe, or 1832. I can't remember what exactly.
And the British were basically being the world policemen in stopping the slave trade.
Yes,
like they were
very aggressive about it.
No more,
way more than the North or any sort of U.S. forces were at the time.
That's one of the interesting things about Guns of the South is they asked the Confederacy to help contribute to ending the slave trade, like immediately after the war ends, and it's kind of like this snub for them, like you're in no position to do this. But though it's not completely ridiculous because the British did acknowledge the Empire of Brazil, which at this point was a huge slave state
and actually had slavery until the 1880s. But that's a little bit, I think, beyond sort of the scope of this podcast. But I think what we wanted to get around to discussing was the best chance for the South to get actual military involvement by the British, not just diplomatic recognition. And this has been a topic that's been floated and is addressed in some alternate history works. But what was called the Trent Affair, and this happened in December of 1861. And the Trent Affair basically involved a U.S. ship, I believe it was the U.S. San Jacinto, seized a British mail steamer, the Trent, that had two Confederate envoys. I think it was Slidell and Mason, if my memory is correct. It's been a while since I've had class in the Civil War, but I'm doing my best here. And it caused a huge international incident. The British were very angry, and there were threats that they would intervene in the war. And the main threat to the Union was not sending the British Army in, because the British Army, contrary to a lot of people's opinion, was not terribly strong at this point, was not very large, but it was the Royal Navy was the worry that they were going to break the blockade that the North had put around the South, part of the Anaconda Plan. And the Trent was seized, and it created this huge hubbub. The British sort of threatened war. The Confederates were very glad about it. But finally, Abraham Lincoln decided that this was not worth a war with the British. So he released the two men. They were sent on their way to Britain. And he used Charles Francis Adams, who was the U.S. ambassador in Britain at the time, to lobby very hard. And he prevented intervention. And our sort of view on it is, what if Britain, for some reason, decided that this was worth war? And I think this could be, of all the scenarios we talked today, this may have given the Confederacy the best chance to win.
Right. And the British wouldn't even have to contribute all that much on the land. Like, just getting goods poured into the Confederacy without any naval interference would have been huge. Like, just receiving all the food that they needed, all the cotton well, maybe not cotton, but all the ammunition they needed.
They would pay for the cotton.
Right.
The how many thousands of bales of cotton that just spent time in ports like Charleston just rotting on the docks because they wanted to go to a market. But the British ultimately transitioned to cotton they got from India and Egypt. So it wasn't that much of a problem. But let's just say, Max, just for the sake of this podcast, that Britain does decide to get involved. That they they decide that this is worth war. Let's say the Union bungles the Trent Affair, and this causes war to start. I can imagine maybe an attack, like a land assault from Canada, but probably would be repulsed. And remember that the vast majority of the British Army at this point on land is in India, so it's going to take them a while to get there. So the real worry for the North is, does breaking let's say the Royal Navy gets involved, and let's say this will be early 1862. Can the Royal Navy breaking the U.S. blockade, the North's blockade, changes the fate of the war? I think that's the real question here. They may bombard part of the U.S. coast, and I know the U.S. has some ironclads coming along at this time. The USS Monitor debuted in March of 1862. But the British also had ironclad ships. They weren't pure ironclads, but they were wooden ships that had iron plating over them, and some of the best in the world, actually. So that becomes the real question. And I don't know, I have an opinion on this, but what's yours?
Absolutely. Like, that would change things immensely, for trade reasons, as well as for just like international diplomatic reasons. Like, just giving the Confederacy a lot of legitimacy in that regard would be huge. Like, it would probably be enough to maybe convince someone like France or of that ilk to throw in their
the French were interested at points, because this is something that not a lot of people know about, but the French actually had invaded Mexico at this time, and it installed a Habsburg sort of lesser prince, Maximilian, as the head of Mexico, and eventually a guerrilla war forced them out. And it was also the threat of the U.S. sort of threatened invasion in about like 1866, I think. And but the French were actually a little bit more gung ho about this in the long run. But I think my personal opinion is that breaking the blockade could very well help the Confederacy. The Union still could have won, I think, in this scenario, but the war may have been extended a year or two, and it would have taken longer, I think, to grind down the South. Or they could have lost. I think this is one. There's some alternate history scenarios that I've read where they have the South winning, and I just look at the circumstances they talk about, and it's like, there's no way. Like, the North was going to still win. But this one, the South actually might have won. They might have seen the breaking of the blockade may have given them enough time to hold out, to grind the Union down in sort of in warfare that was such a heavy cost that it may have caused Abraham Lincoln to lose re-election in 1864 if the war goes on that long, and sort of a Democratic challenger, maybe, I think the names I've heard floated were George McClellan. Well, he actually was a candidate, but there were some other ones at the time too. May have defeated him and caused, or the war could have ended in 1863. Either way, I think this is equal chance that the North may have won, eked out a victory, or the South could have won. And I think this is a turning. This could have been a turning point, and you have to sort of, Abraham Lincoln was very lucky to avoid this, and he actually sort of, I don't want to say bowed down to the British, but he sort of humbled himself in the U.S. and it made it very clear that they were that I think they sacked the guy who was on the San Jacinto, the captain, and made it clear that this wasn't going to happen again, and it never did. And Charles Francis Adams is almost unknown today. He was the grandson of John Adams, was he John? Yeah, it was John Quincy Adams' son, and he deserves a lot of credit for holding out the British. So I think this is a very interesting one, and I think we're going to talk a lot about believability of these scenarios on this. And I'm no Confederate apologist. I'm not going to say they had a lot of chances to win the war, because they really didn't. But this may have given them a chance. I'm going to give them that.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think our next topic is this is a kind of a more of an unusual one, maybe, but this is one that I'm interested in, is the idea of Robert E. Lee fighting for the North. And I think this is sort of well known. This was actually depicted in the movie Gods and Generals, which I do not recommend seeing, because it is not a very good movie about the Civil War, and neither is the movie Gettysburg. Actually, there's parts of it. The little round top scene in Gettysburg is actually really good, but other than that, and the scene where Ted Turner gets killed. But
yes,
he's actually briefly in that movie, but not a huge fan of Ted
as
Turner.
well as Gettysburg as well.
Yes, he's in Gettysburg. He's in both the movies, but he gets killed in Gettysburg. But that's a little bit of a side note. But for Robert E. Lee in the movie Gods and Generals, you see him, a representative. It was Francis Blair, who was a senior sort of politician at the time, made Lincoln's offer to Robert E. Lee that, hey, you can be commander of the armies or attain a significant position, because he was a very well-respected soldier before the war. He had served out west. He had had an incredible career in Mexico. And some people at the time had pegged him as sort of a future head of the army in a couple years after Winfield Scott sort of went away. And everyone knows that he said, no, I will fight for my state of Virginia. And that led him to fight for the Confederacy. But let's say Lee sticks with the North. He decides that his loyalty really is to the Union. What happens from here? I think, this is my personal opinion, is that he may have gone out west. He may have said, yes, I will serve this army, but I cannot serve against my home state of Virginia. So he may have been sent out to, potentially out to Tennessee, where Ulysses S. Grant was, or maybe sent out to Missouri. There was actually a lot of action very early in the war in Missouri that put the state at risk to maybe falling to the Confederates. Maybe he goes out there. But what are your thoughts on this, Mac?
Well, Would he really have done that, though? I mean, to be
Yeah.
fair, not all. Well, also something to point out here is that not all of Virginia went to the South. Like that's the reason we have West Virginia, because
Yep.
that region did not want to go along with that.
Robert E. Lee, though, was tied in very much with the old Virginia. I mean, his father, Light Horse Harry Lee, served in the American Revolution. He is a signer of the American Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
So he came from a very long and distinguished line, sort of Virginia aristocracy. And I agree with you. I would put the probability of this actually happening would have been very low.
Yeah.
But here we're just discussing this. So let's say we put Lee in this. Does he actually end the war sooner? This is something interesting.
Well, absolutely, because he's such an important and competent general for the South. I mean, without him, that would have been just terrible for them. I'm not sure they would have been able to.
I think it would have been very difficult because, I mean, I was pondering this sort of as I was preparing my notes for this podcast, and I couldn't think of anyone else really who stands out. Maybe Stonewall Jackson, but Stonewall Jackson never had an army-level command in real life, so we don't have any indication of how that would have worked. Stonewall Jackson was also very erratic, and Lee was a very stabilizing figure within the Confederate Army. But when I bring this up, I actually want to briefly mention, I wish I could remember the name of the story. It's in an anthology by Martin Green, who's the editor of Martin Greenberg. It's a very good one, and it basically it's a story of this. It's a black guy who is a physicist in the 1930s, and it's in an alternate universe, an alternate history, basically, in which Robert E. Lee joins the North. He ends the war by the fall of 1862. And he just beats the Confederacy up, and they just have no answer. And he lives in Germany in the 1930s, and he works with Einstein and all this, and he develops a time machine, and he wants to go back in time because he says, I want Robert E. Lee to fight for the South because the position of blacks is worse in his history, even worse in the aftermath of the Civil War, because there is no Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery is abolished, but it takes years, and it's a really bad situation. So he goes back, he changes history, and the point is that he actually, when he goes back in time, he ends up in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, which was not a good place to be. But the point is that Robert E. Lee intervening may have ended the war sooner, but that may have created worse possibilities for certain people like blacks.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's a real concern. I think and I think that's it's a good point that he makes in that story, that not all alternate history makes history better for certain people, or some history may get better for some people. So, that would benefit a history like that, benefit the soldiers who, were killed at Gettysburg, but that does not benefit others. So I think that's a good lesson of alternate history, is that, sort of with every action, there's a reaction.
Certainly.
And that cannot always be a good reaction. Like
a Civil War that ends much, much sooner, that does not have as much of a human and resource cost, maybe it wouldn't be seen as so much of a deal by history. Like, slavery is not that important. Like, maybe, like you said, people just don't attack the issue as much, and it's much easier to be a Confederate apologist afterwards.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, this big valiant stand that just got crushed immediately.
Yeah, that we never had a chance, sort of thing. And I
like
agree.
a John Brown sort of thing in the other direction.
Yeah,
like
and that may have been, in the long run, that may have been a lot worse. And I think it probably would have been a lot worse. And it would have been interesting to have seen. And honestly, it would not have benefited those who were enslaved, because a gradual, I do not see how gradual abolition is better than immediate. Like, there's no way that it's worse. I mean, so I think that's the lesson of alternate history, is it teaches us. A lot of people complain about the way history has turned out, and a lot of people have legitimate grievances. But I think a good lesson that we learned from alternate history is that it could have been worse. That not all possibilities in the different possibilities are better. Or that some people really could falter from that. I think the next thing we wanted to talk about were some divergent battles. And the first one is obviously the most famous battle of the Civil War, Gettysburg. Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st through 3rd, 1863, the turning point of the war in the East. And I think I wanted to start out with talking about an interesting possibility that's been addressed in a few works of alternate history, which is a battle at Pipe Creek instead of Gettysburg. And if you don't know what Pipe Creek is basically it's a position in northern Maryland. It's about 5 miles south of the Pennsylvania border. And Union engineers had been preparing this as the actual sort of defensive line they wanted to fight a battle against Lee on. General George Meade, who was a Union commander at Gettysburg, had been an engineer before the war, a military engineer, and he wanted to fight the battle there because it was even better terrain than the Gettysburg was, even though Gettysburg was pretty advantageous terrain. It would have been very tough. They had fortifications that had already been built there, or trench lines. It was excellent high ground. It turned out the way the battle worked out that the battle just happened at Gettysburg because of sort of the confluence of events, but I think it'd be interesting to discuss what happens at Pipe Creek if somehow Meade manages to get to that line and force Lee to attack him. And I think you could have seen a victory even greater than Gettysburg in some ways.
Absolutely.
Because imagine if all battles, of all confrontations within the Battle of Gettysburg were Pickett's charge. That's basically what an attack on Pipe Creek would have been.
Yeah.
And probably disastrous for the Confederates because Lee had to bring battle somewhere north of the Potomac. He could not have retreated back because then the people in the South would have been like, why did you just go on this big raid? Why not attack Washington?
Yeah.
And if Meade is positioned, because Pipe Creek would block the way to Washington. It's along is it the Emmetsburg Road or the Taneytown Road? One of the two main, I think maybe in the Taneytown Road, which is if you don't know what that is, that's one of the main roads that run south of Gettysburg, and it's the line of communication with Washington, D.C. If Meade sits astride that's the route to D.C. So Lee's going to have to force battle, and if it comes down to Pipe Creek, Meade is going to be there. And I mean, what do you think about this?
Totally. Like, a crushing defeat there would have ended the war far sooner, I think.
Possibly. Yeah.
We wouldn't have seen a battle of the Wilderness. We wouldn't have seen all that stuff. Like, we might have seen the end of the war just a few months after that.
Yeah, that would have been a big deal. And that would have changed. That would have been a big change, too, without 1864, because 1864 may have been the bloodiest year of the war. I can't remember the exact statistics, but people don't get short shrift. I guess short shrift is given to to what happens in 1864 because everyone thinks it's Gettysburg and then they think, oh, then the war ends in 1865. Like the whole campaign that gets, because people forget Ulysses S. Grant was not at the Battle of Gettysburg. It's George Meade, who almost no one knows about today. I mean, historians don't know who he is, but I mean, and maybe history buffs do. But like people forget that it wasn't Grant versus Lee the entire time. It was only Grant versus Lee for about a year, 11 months, from May 1864 to April of 1865. So.
Well, what if there was a confrontation between Lee and Grant in 1864? Like, let's say in Georgia, for instance.
Oh, yes. I think this is another thing we wanted to talk about. This is a special. I'm interested in this because I actually sought out the advice of an old professor of mine who is a specialist in the Civil War. He's written a bunch of books about it, and he knows a ton about this, and especially about the Georgia campaign of 1864. And probably another disaster for the Confederacy because basically in this scenario what would happen is we would have Jefferson Davis sort of tell Robert E. Lee like the key front of the war is Georgia, it's Atlanta. If we have to keep Atlanta in Confederate hands or the war is lost. And in real life I think he may have may have probed and seen if his interest was in that, but as my teacher told me, he said, Robert E. Lee wanted to fight for Virginia and not the Confederacy. Like he was there to protect his home state. So he may have even, I don't know if he would have disobeyed a direct order, but he would have pushed strongly against it. But let's just say, for argument's sake, Jefferson Davis sort of gives him an order like, General Lee, like you need to go to Georgia. So let's say he does. He may bring some troops with him, but the army in Georgia was about 65,000 men, the Confederate Army, the Army of Tennessee. I think Sherman had 98,000 when he marched out in 1864. He'll probably get extra troops, and in this case, Grant will not go east. He'll still become the head of the whole Union Army, but he will stay with Sherman because Lee is obviously a greater threat than probably James Longstreet would probably get command out in the east. So you'd see probably Lee would be more aggressive than Joe Johnston, who is or maybe even John Bell Hood, who were the Confederate commanders outside of Atlanta. He may have resisted Grant more strongly, but Grant was, people forget this, but Grant was a master of maneuvering. Like, if you really study his campaign around Vicksburg, it's masterful. Like, it's incredible how the way he maneuvered his troops. And I think Grant and Sherman together, they would have defeated. Lee may have held them back a little bit longer, but ultimately, with his lack of numbers, I think Atlanta is still going to fall before November of 1864. So I don't know if that's a huge change there. So I think there was one other wanted to discuss. Oh yes, this is a talk about. This is sort of an interesting sort of little side note is the Battle of the Crater. You've ever heard of the Battle of the Crater, Max?
Yeah, the Battle of the Crater.
This is a really interesting footnote not footnote, it's a battle, but almost no one knows about this.
Right.
But do you want to elaborate or do you want me?
Yeah, it was the Union encountered a large Confederate
Series of fortifications.
Fortification, yeah. They're a large
it was
fortification
outside of Petersburg in August of 1864. So this is the point where Lee is settled into siege with Grant.
Yes. And they had this plan to have sappers burrow underneath this fortification and pack it full of explosives and just blow it sky high. Just blow the whole thing up. And they did.
They did, yes.
They blew the hell out of those guys.
Yes, and it was several thousand pounds of gunpowder, if I remember. But here's the thing. What they were going to do is...
Helm's Deep.
Yes, Helm's Deep-esque. But what they were going to do is they trained a division of black soldiers, specifically, to... what they were going to do is they were going to surge around the edge of the crater. The crater was going to open up a hole in the Confederate line. They would surge around this, and they would break open the Confederate line. Hopefully they could capture Petersburg because of this, was the hope. And maybe break the siege, or at best put a huge indent into Robert E. Lee's line. Well, these troops were in the 9th Corps. And you say, well, what the hell's the 9th Corps? Well, the 9th Corps was unfortunately commanded by Ambrose Burnside.
Ooh,
yeah. One of the more disastrous Union leaders of the war, famous for his the sideburns are named after him, Burnside, but terrible general. And Ambrose Burnside, I think, was it him or Grant? Someone decided, I think it was Burnside, decided that it was unacceptable to be using black troops at this time. So they entailed some white divisions, so this is divisions made up of white soldiers, to attack. And they didn't get the training that these black soldiers did because they were swapped out like a day before the battle. And their leader, I think it was General Nagel at that battle, who was also a drunk and was actually drunk during the attack. That also is a problem. But these soldiers, when they blew the line, they attacked. Instead of going around the edges of the crater, they just marched straight into the crater. And guess what happens when you march into a big crater that you can't march out of? And the Confederate soldiers arrive on the edge of it. Oh boy.
Turkey shoot.
Yeah, and it was a disaster. It was utter disaster. And even some of the black soldiers were sent in later, and unfortunately they got also funneled into the crater. Big problem. A real huge disaster for the Union. But our question is, alternate battle of the crater. What if they stuck with the initial plan? You could have seen a major breakthrough. Anything from maybe the war ends, maybe they can blast so far into Robert E. Lee's lines. I don't know if it could have ended the war, but it may have put a huge indent and even shaken the Confederates even further.
Yes, because it would be another example of the effective use of black troops, which might have led to more widespread use elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think also this was a huge opening in Lee's lines were already very tenuous. Lee's numbers had dropped. The Overland campaign had gutted his army. He was holding it together by force of will and the fact that they were in such deep positions, trenches. They used fortifications. And I think they could have, this could have been a good opportunity for the North, but they wasted it.
Yeah.
And now, I think we're going to go to a different part. This is another interesting topic. So we're moving away from battles now, and now we're going to talk about something. We'll talk about a post-war Confederacy. So we'll just give the South the win. They have
somehow
we don't know exactly. Maybe we can maybe go back to our earlier one. Maybe maybe the British intervene, and this causes the South to win. So what is the post? Now we're in. This is 18. We'll say it's 1867, 1868. What does the Confederacy look like? Nice.
Well, okay. There's a lot of problems with this. For one, slavery. Slavery was kind of on the way out in terms of big countries around the world. Like, everyone was really getting rid of it. The only really big example was Brazil. And, hey, Brazil got rid of it in the 1880s. So it's not like that was a good example of the longevity of slavery. Plus, it's extremely unpopular. You're not going to get a lot of... if you did get support from the British, almost certainly there were strings attached with, you're going to get rid of slavery. Yeah. Or you're going to do something like that.
I think it's an institution that was very much doomed. And actually, Robert Ransom, I believe is his name, wrote a book called The Confederate States of America: What Might Have Been, and I believe he is an economist or a historian, who sort of examines this from an economic perspective. And he talks about what does a South look like, economically, and not good. Probably slavery is out by the 1880s, probably in a form of some sort of gradual abolition through, you would pay slave owners for what they lost. I think it's just that economy just isn't going to work in an increasingly mechanized world. The North, let's say a North that has lost the South, like they'll still be fine. Like Chicago, Pittsburgh, the great cities of the East are still going to become heavily mechanized. Andrew Carnegie is still going to be around. J.P. Morgan, and they still have the whole West, the resources of the American West that hadn't been really tapped before the 1860s.
And even if the Confederates, negotiate some kind of truce, you know what the North's going to want to do? They're going to want to take it back immediately. Like, they're going to be doing everything in their power to undermine the authority of this new Confederacy, like running guns in, starting slave rebellions.
Yeah, well, also, it's interesting, like, the South, let's say the Confederate Congress decides at some point in the 1870s or 1880s we have to get rid of the institution of slavery. Well, it's enshrined in the Confederate Constitution, so there's going to be challenges. And here's the killer for them, is that the precedent has been established that when a state disagrees with a central government, they can secede. And imagine this. You could have very well seen a Confederate state saying, we don't have to listen to the central authority. We're going to secede. And what are you going to do? You're going to fight us just like the North to bring us back into the fold?
The Third American Revolution.
Yeah, I mean...
Shortly followed by the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th.
Yes. It's just... Well, I think you get our point here is that the South, like, it just is not very tenable. And even in a wake of a victory, they're going to have still suffered a ton of damage. States are going to have been occupied by... Big swaths of states occupied by the North. Huge damage. And then you've got... slave populations who, let's say like the city of New Orleans had been under Union control. Let's say the war ends the end of 1863. They win the Battle of Gettysburg, and that causes the war to end, which I have disagreements with whether that even really would have worked. Because people forget Vicksburg the next day out west.
Right.
But circling back to what we were talking about, it's like New Orleans had been under Union control since April 1862. So you have a whole population of slaves who've been basically free for 2 years. I mean, what are you going to do? Are you just going to? You do think they're going to walk right back into the arms of their former owners?
Exactly.
No.
Oh, hey guys.
I mean, and then you're going to probably have abolitionists emboldened by the war, probably running guns. I mean, there was by that point. Let's say the war ends in December of 1863. There were Union regiments of black soldiers who had fought. The 54th Massachusetts, the people from the movie Glory. That was July of 1863. Battery Wagner, which is just outside of Charleston. Like that, there was other units that had fought out in the West. This is going to be a huge problem for the Confederacy, and the threat of slave revolt is going to grow to the point that it's going to become a problem. And even after that, let's say slavery is abolished, I don't think that they're not going to probably give lots of rights to the former slaves, which could cause even more issues down the line.
What they could do is that they could make slavery extremely unadvantageous. Like they could add all sorts of legislation to it to make it just not make sense economically. Yeah. Like, okay, this is no longer making any money. Like, this is stupid. I'm just going to start freeing all these people. But then the question comes, like, can these people vote after they're no longer slaves?
Probably
Are these
not.
freemen?
No,
probably not.
Certainly not.
But what if they could? Like, the Confederacy is, 50% black at this point?
Probably close to it, yeah, with the growth, in population. In some states, like South Carolina, during the Civil War, were majority slave. The slave states, which was called, it was the Black Belt at the time, is what they called it, which is the belt of sort of the swath of communities that go down from South Carolina through Georgia into Alabama and Mississippi, which are the best places to grow cotton. And this is an area that was very heavily black, and it includes most of South Carolina. I think it was something like 55% of the population were slaves. And that, if you're a slave owner, is a huge problem. And that's why people don't understand how incredibly damaging Nat Turner's revolt was in the 1830s in Virginia. It scared the shit out of people. I'm just going to say it, because it showed them what could happen in this case. And that's why John Brown was so strongly resisted. That's why he wasn't just kicked out of Virginia and why he was executed. Was the fact that this was a real danger, and people were worried about this because this is the era before there's no machine guns, there's no artillery. So basically, pound for pound, each soldier is basically equal to one of the other. And it's basically a game of who has more soldiers. So it's not like you have a machine gun that you can hold a position for a long time with 3 people. Like, this is an era of musket loading rifles, or muskets, actually. Rifles weren't terribly common, or basic, which we would call probably very archaic shotguns. It would be a huge problem. And that's why why probably in the long run slavery isn't going to last more than maybe 25 years after a Confederate victory.
And here's another problem here. The times. Like, what becomes much more popular later on in history is Marxism. And you know what would be the perfect place for a Marxist rebellion, or maybe more of a Maoist rebellion since it's more agrarian. But
a form of Marxism.
A form of Marxism is a Confederate nation.
Yes.
Like, that would be just
a nation where a huge part of the population is oppressed, even if slavery has been abolished, where almost certainly blacks are still second-class citizens. Almost certainly. There's no way, even if slavery was abolished, they still wouldn't have been considered the same as white citizens. And that sets up a perfect example, a place for, we're not condoning Marxism, but we're saying that this is a place where it could have emerged. And actually, Harry Turtledove, in his Great War series, which I mentioned earlier, there is a Marxist sort of rebellion that breaks out during what is World War I in the book. And it's amongst freed blacks, who are living. This is it's like 30 years after they've been freed, but still, they're still very oppressed. They're sharecroppers still, basically, and they sort of Marxist works get circulated around, and they revolt, and it's a big time issue.
Yeah.
So, and I think you want to expand further on this, because I know this is the one you actually proposed this idea, and I really liked it a lot.
Yeah, let's say I was living in Germany at that time, and I was a Marxist intellectual. I would be going ham at the opportunity to go to the Confederacy and just start just stirring up trouble all over the place, because it would be so easy.
Yeah. I mean, you might have seen someone, a Lenin sort of, not a Lenin sort of figure. What I'm talking about is sort of Leninist thought, because original, classic Marxism is all about mechanization. But you may have seen sort of more fringe Marxist figures saying, and making the decision that sort of Lenin did, saying this may be, agrarian populations can be Marxist too, and they may have that may have become later on. I don't know how far in the future. It may have taken until the early 1900s for something like this to emerge, but that would have been very dangerous for a Confederacy that. What do they? I don't know what they look like at this point, but this is not a great position to be in.
No.
And so basically, the point we're trying to make is that, for all those people, if there's anyone who's ever thought to themselves, this would be a terrible, there's maybe the people out there who say, maybe what if this Confederacy survived? Would it have been good? We're saying something. No, it would not have been.
Yeah, it would have been a disaster.
It would have been a disaster, and the Confederacy isn't going to emerge out of the Civil War, they're so powerful and incredible. Like, the fact is that we're trying to make the point is that we're not. I wouldn't say we're deterministic historians. This is the way history is going to happen all the time. But historians have to acknowledge that there are trends, and there's certain things that you just can't reverse on a dime. And there's some alternate histories that there's Ward Moore's bring on the Jubilee, which is from the 1950s. It talks about the Confederacy is it's like the world's most powerful nation in the 1870s. No, it's not going to happen like that.
Absolutely not.
It just is. There's the fact that they have to deal with slavery and freed slaves is going to be an issue that's going to probably dominate a Confederacy. And how can they be productive if they have to deal with this sort of issue? So we're saying that don't think that, oh boy, they win the war and it's all the easy street from there.
No. It would take a bunch of racist South Africans bringing back a bunch of AK-47s.
That's just them winning the war. And honestly, the point is...
No, but they also have to kill Robert E. Lee's wife. That's the other thing. And then it's easy street after
honestly,
that.
I think we were mentioning sort of bringing this back to the literature. This actually, if they had to make them... There are some movies that have alternate histories, and technically you could argue any movie that the history, anything is slightly different from reality is alternate history. But I would consider there's very few works out there that are alternate history where the main focus is the fact that history has changed. I think a Guns of the South movie could work.
Yeah, totally. That would be a very interesting film, though there would have to be some changes.
Yes, absolutely.
For one, kill off Nathan Bedford Forrest pretty early. I don't think...
Yeah, we're not Nathan Bedford Forrest fans, as you can tell.
No, we're not. And I don't think the rest of the world is either. So just have him get shot early on. Like, don't have any of the stuff at the end of the book where he's part of the.
I think people would,
because he's actually part of the siege against the evil South Africans.
Well, he becomes like a sort of a puppet of them, and then all of a sudden he loses. He runs against Lee in the election, he loses, and then all of a sudden he's like, I'm at your service. Robert E. Lee, and sort of, excuse me, he just sort of, his character just changes all of a sudden.
Exactly.
Which is not the way it would have been. But it would be, I think I would certainly, ticket prices are insane today for movies, but I think I would certainly pay some money to go see a movie in which soldiers battled, each other with AK-47s during the Civil War.
That would be,
maybe
really
you could
cool.
change it by having like some patriotic American bring back M16s to supply the North, so you could see.
Right, so it's an even bigger victory.
No, so it's the North.
We just
versus the
didn't
South.
win hard
it's
enough.
So if anyone's ever worried about the old argument of the AK-47 versus the M16, we can have. If you ever wanted to see people in the Civil War settle your argument, maybe you could do it that way. But I'm not a screenwriter, so I can't really.
And then
talk
Jacob
about it.
Zuma makes a time machine, and he sends Galils back to the Bantu people back then. Just to make things even more crazy. Just everybody's doing everything.
I think there was actually one last thing we wanted to talk about. Maybe we can consider this sort of the miscellaneous section of the podcast. But we talked about how does this, beyond the Americas, how does a change in history during the American Civil War affect people? And this is sort of very interesting and maybe a little esoteric almost. But I know, Max, you talked about this.
Yes, the Taiping Rebellion was occurring around this time. I believe it began, what was it? The
1850?
1850, yeah, I believe so.
It's been going on for a while. And why don't you describe what it is? Because the Taiping Rebellion is very little known.
It's nuts. It's ridiculous. So there's this populist Christian rebellion that occurs in southern China that opposes the imperial Chinese authority.
The Qing government.
Yeah, the Qing government.
The Manchu government, I guess, would be a better way. The Manchu dynasty that rules China.
People don't really talk about this very much, but it was one of the bloodiest wars in history.
I believe it was I think this is correct, but I'm pretty sure that I found a source that said that the Taiping Rebellion is the second bloodiest conflict of all time after World War II. That it is bloodier than World War I.
Yes.
Like, I would have, if someone had told me before, what are the two bloodiest wars ever? I would have said World War II and World War I. No, it's the Taiping Rebellion. And I think it went on for about 15 years. Was it 1850 to 1865 or 1864 or 1866? Give or take a couple year or two, but it's massive conflict. But how does this connect to the Civil War, the American Civil War?
If the American Civil War is ended very quickly, like, let's be ridiculous here, that it
1861.
ends. Yeah, it's just immediate. Like, Manassas goes real rotten
for the Confederacy. Yeah,
and
Bull Run is a huge victory for the North, and the South just sort of gives in.
Yeah, like it was like a Shays Rebellion kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, geez, I'm sorry, I guess I was wrong. And then America has all this military might and nowhere to use it. And hey, there's this thing happening in China. Maybe this is a great opportunity to establish a lot of influence over a foreign power that has a lot of very interesting resources that we might be
interested
into
acquiring.
acquiring.
in trade.
Yeah, so
U.S. sending troops to the Taiping Rebellion. What do you think?
To be fair, the Taiping Rebellion was run by a lot of very incompetent people who have no idea what the hell they're doing, which is a lot of the reason why, one, it lasted so long, and two, so many people died. But if they had maybe just they wouldn't even have to have that many American soldiers, but just advisors, just telling them what their chances were, what they should be doing with their troops.
They may have sent troops. I mean, I could see a division or two being sent.
Oh,
some
yeah.
sort of expeditionary force. Well, there were Marines at the time, so maybe a regiment of Marines and two brigades of infantry. So obviously, the army is going to shrink in the aftermath of a quick victory. But the regular U.S. Army existed, and there were about 10 U.S. Army regiments that were infantry, other cavalry. So maybe send a couple of those over in a brigade form with the regiment of Marines. Maybe because the British actually and the French did see some action. Have you ever heard of, if there's George Gordon, who is, he's called Chinese Gordon, who is a famous British general he was famous for dying in Khartoum in the 1880s, fighting against were Mahdist forces, the forces of the Mahdi, which is totally outside the scope of this. But it's very interesting. If you ever want to read about it, I recommend reading. It's fascinating. If you want to know about how Britain got involved in the Nile and all that, and Egypt and Sudan and such. But he made his name fighting in what was the Second Opium War, which lasted at the same time. The Brits basically fighting a war so they could import as much opium as they wanted into China. And basically, the Chinese government said, we know we don't want opium because it's a scourge. And the British said, oh, yes, you do want opium because it's good for our business. But so they sent troops there, too. So American troops fighting there. They may have. I don't know if they could have changed the whole scope of the war. But a brigade. There were American mercenaries who fought there.
Yes, absolutely.
But I don't. It'd be interesting to see.
There were also many Western people that were co-opted into the rebellion that were that surrounded the. I wouldn't call him an emperor, but the king, I guess, that they had established there, Hong Xiuqiu, who was, by the way, nuts. By the way,
Yeah,
I don't know if we've noted. I don't think we mentioned.
I don't
this.
think we've said this. Yeah.
Called himself Jesus's little brother.
Yeah, he's younger brother. He
Yeah.
claimed to be yeah. Well, he claimed to also be he was the rightful heir to the Chinese. He'd be the rightful Chinese emperor. Who I forget who the emperor was at this time, but you know, it was a long drawn out battle, a war. Battle is not a good word to use.
Yeah,
war is,
no,
it was a
all
huge
out.
conflict. But basically, eventually, the Chinese central government, with aid from other forces, managed to subdue the Taipings. And American troops may have contributed. I don't know if they really make a huge difference, but maybe you hear, maybe I think that would be the U.S. getting involved more. Maybe that would end up seeing U.S. more expansionistic earlier on, before 1898, before the Spanish-American War. But I don't know if this isn't a huge change. This is just something we wanted to discuss because Max, I think, mentioned it, and I thought, oh, that's sort of interesting thing. Let's talk about this.
Plus, the only reason you would get involved in this is if you think that you can control this guy after you win.
Yeah, trade concessions or
and
something like that.
this guy's
well, who are they?
nuts,
I guess I'm assuming
so.
they're fighting for the imperial Chinese government, but maybe they would. I don't know. They maybe would, because the British fought against
either way. I mean,
the Taipings.
Either way, there's not a whole lot of confidence in the people that are.
I think it would be an
things.
interesting footnote. It'd be something that if this had happened, people like us would maybe be mentioning it. Ooh, this is kind of what is this happening? But I think it's cool to talk about.
I mean, it certainly would have helped no matter what they did.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. Western forces with rifles. Remember, this is something too that was a big change in the Civil War, was the fact that rifles were really used over. I mean, the Crimean War saw the first mass usage of rifles, and hell, even American sharpshooters were using them in the American Revolutionary War. But I think we're wrapping up for today.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say, I'm gonna what our next topic is. If you want to tune in again, our next topic will be D-Day. Alternate D-Days. It's going to be really interesting. We're going to talk about, sort of do it in a similar format that we've done today, and I hope you have enjoyed it, and hope you will tune in again for Talkernate History.
Yep.
So this is Matt signing out.
And this is also Max signing out.
Catch you later.
All right.